The Art of Being Ruled. Wyndham Lewis. Original publication 1926. 1989 edition. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Part 9. Man and Shaman. Chapter 8. Paiderastia in the Greek World. Dollinger complains that in Greece the strictest moralists, even, were very indulgent where inversion was concerned. Nay, worse than merely indulgent, he exclaims, for they actually treated it with ridicule. Ridicule is not a thing on which fashions in vice, any more than other fashions, ultimately thrive. So perhaps Dollinger was here a little beside the mark in his censure of the Greek attitude. The sternest moralists could not devise a better system for dealing with inversion than treating it on equal terms with other forms of sex emotion. Its prestige relies entirely on the assumption that it is a non-sexual, or supersexual, cult, which of course it is not. At its most natural, in the case of the congenital invert, it is always a passion, coloring everything about the life of the individual marked down as its prey, but, this intensity apart, it has a right to rank without comment alongside other forms of sex liveliness. When acquired or affected as a social asset, it is a snobbery rather than a vice, and often involves other sorts of snobbery as well. The Spanish ambassador, who took the place of a defective one, in the Memoirs of Saint-Simon, and who exclaimed ecstatically, peeping sideways, as Monsieur rose to receive him, "Oh, quel joli col," could provide one of the links between this snobbery and that of the social snob. Paiderastia, love of boys, was organized politically in Greece, whereas in the countries of the ancient East, though naturally flourishing, it had not this utilitarian character. It was left to the Greek to discover the educational possibilities of paiderasty. In the Doric states, Crete and Sparta, it was of course equally recognized as part of the educational machinery. Xenophon claimed an equal purity for the Spartan love of the adult man for the boy as for the love of the parent for the child. However, a great deal of etiquette existed in connection with these habits. Not only was the utilitarian side of the question not neglected, but chivalry was foreshadowed by the Greeks in their ideal manipulation of this ruling passion. A glimpse of a beautiful boy half-naked causes the really sensitive person to swoon. When the youthful Megabetus offers to kiss Agesilaus, and he, calling up the self-mastery of which only a Spartan would be capable, refuses, Maximus of Tyre considers that he is a hero of the same order as Leonidas, and that his refraining from this simple operation was a feat comparable to Thermopylae. In the whole literature of the pre-Christian period there is hardly a writer to be met with who has expressed himself in decidedly hostile terms of homosexuality, says Dollinger. Both eminent men of all sorts and the gods were employed to advertise it and so subjugate the social snob and the superstitious. The legislation of Solon, preventing slaves from indulging this form of love, was designed to reserve it for free persons only, and so still further excite the snobbery of the time in surrounding it with the glamour of privilege. The philosopher, who was of course an important person, further advertised it. The marriage bond was made for all other men, but the philosopher might be indulged in his passion for boys. In this way the support of intellectual snobbery was secured. The Athenian legislation against habits of sex inversion among slaves was very analogous to the prohibition laws in the United States, suppression directed only at one class of society. Beautiful male slaves, however, were forced into public brothels appropriated to male traffic only. In this way it was said that Phaedo, the founder of the Socratic Elean school, started life. Agathocles, the tyrant of Syracuse, made his debut in a similar establishment. Male prostitution was, however, taxed, and so became a source of revenue. As to the chivalrous observances and claims to purity of the man obsession in Greece, it is easy to believe that it may have been, on the whole, slightly more platonic than woman-man relationship would be. But the two wild horses must have met together fairly often in an aristocratic society devoted to good living and a studied idleness. Schools, gymnasia, and palaestry were supposed not to be entered by adults, but this law fell into disuse, and many of the hours the Athenian citizen had daily on his hands were spent there. In many gymnasia and palaestry altars to Eros were erected. This was the ordinary resort of the paiderasts, says Dollinger. There his wings grew so large, according to Plutarch, that there was no containing him. However, it was the status of women that determined the flourishing of this other form of sex. The displacement of the relative positions of the sexes, the degradation of the woman, and the exclusion of the uninitiated part of them from men's society, was the cause, as well as the sign, of the rival attachment. The social contempt for women played a capital part, and social snobbery transferred the attentions of the indifferent average in the direction of the more philosophic and peculiar principle of love. For a free citizen or a man of education, love for a woman was regarded as a dishonorable and vulgar passion. Women suffered in every way from its prevalence. And it is at this point that it is easy to see how very greatly Greek homosexual chivalry and idealism must have differed from the same movement in our time. For the position of women and the status of the slave at the time of the prevalence of such a fashion must both affect its form very much. Plato says that it is not naturally, but only by the compulsion of the law, that a man whose inclinations have been to the love of boys enters into the bonds of matrimony. The free Hellene appears to have regarded matrimony as a great burden. But to remain celibate was regarded as disgraceful, for one of the only forms of work that was expected of a free Hellene was once or twice in a lifetime the reproducing of his kind. But this patriotism made obligatory. With the dissolution of the Greek republics and the consequent removal of the laws of compulsion, the marriage duty appears to have been universally neglected, and depopulation ensued. With this attitude towards women, the form paiderastia would take would be different to that found in the midst of a society more and more dominated by women, as is the case today. When the Hellene, experiencing a contempt and distaste for creatures that he considered as of an inferior kind or class, withdrew as far as possible from their society, he would not be so likely to admire specifically feminine qualities in the new male object of his interest. The specifically feminine, though certainly it is impossible to imagine paiderastia without to some extent a conversion of the male into a female, would be less prized, and theoretically, since it was that from which men were attempting to escape, some masculine version of the sexual charm would be de rigueur.